And like I did last week, I'm going to begin with an announcement. If you happen to be in the Front Range area of northern Colorado, we do currently have an exceptional exhibit of two of Colorado's finest artists on display at the Off-Broadway Gallery at Pine Street Church. The works of Michael Sharon and Shay Davis will be on display through the last weekend of March. So I hope you'll take the opportunity, if you haven't done so, to stop by and see it. Also, there is in Denver and other cities an immersive Frida Kahlo event. It comes on the heels of the successful immersive Vincent van Gogh event, which I do believe many of you have attended. Now, we could say Frida Kahlo's divided self is a legacy of the actions of an indigenous woman who would play a major role in Mexican history, and the Denver Art Museum currently has an exhibit about her life, the legacy of La Malinche or La Malinche, however you want to pronounce it. She was an indigenous Mexican woman who served as a guide and interpreter for the Spanish conquistador, Hernan Cortez. So you probably can imagine she is a controversial figure from the Mexican people. Well, I decided to do an immersive weekend for us on the legacy of La Malinche, which includes Frida Kahlo. On March 26th, 10 to noon, we're going to do a 2-hour presentation on Frida Kahlo and the divided self. On March 27th, the very next day, is Art Brunch, and the topic is going to be Fateful Choices, the Legacy of La Malinche. And then on Tuesday, March 29th, I've tentatively scheduled for 10:30 a.m. a tour at the Denver Art Museum of that exhibit, Trader's Survivor Icon, the Legacy of La Malinche. And it's going to be followed by an optional lunch where we can continue to discuss the topic. Now let me continue with just a brief summary of what we discussed last week. Last week, we dealt with the issue of racism. And we focused in particular on Renaissance Europe's coming to terms with its growing multicultural reality due to the dramatic expansion of global trade, which included the slave trade. And we saw this growing multicultural reality specifically through the artistic renderings of the three magi. A black magi, known as Balthazar in later tradition, first appears in the art of the late Middle Ages, but it's expanded upon by Renaissance artists. And we saw how renderings of Balthazar reflected the various ways Europe viewed people of African descent that they were now encountering and interacting with on a regular basis, particularly in the port cities. Finally, we ended with this image. It was African-American artist Henry Osawa Tanner who was able to express the subject of the three magi that moved beyond issues of race to the universalization of the magi as symbols of wisdom and spiritual ideas. Now, it may seem to many of us that racism and tribalism overlap, and they do a little bit, but tribalism goes beyond the issue of race towards social identity. So let's move on to today's topic. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, there are two main definitions of tribalism. The state of existing as a tribe or a very strong feeling of loyalty to your tribe, that's the first one. The second one is a very strong feeling of loyalty to a political or social group so that you support them, whatever they do. Well, today I want to address the second definition, since that is the experience of most, if not all of us, living in the Western setting. Let me qualify further what I mean by tribalism for this presentation. In the business world or nonprofit world, the term tribe has a positive connotation. It refers to a community devoted to an idea or a product or service to such a degree that the leaders of such a tribe can harness the devotion of that community for a positive end, like profits or building a strong movement. Today, I'm referring to the more negative, divisive brand of tribalism that all of us, I'm sure, have witnessed as a growing trend over the last 3 or 4 decades. Such tribes form over perceived cultural, political, racial, gender, economic, educational, and religious identity. Even sports teams are a source of divisive tribal formulation, maybe the most common and violent form of it. Attend an English professional soccer game and you'll see exactly what I mean. Art, whether done consciously by the artist or unconsciously, which is more typical, has addressed this issue of tribalism throughout its history. One way it does this is by expanding our perspective on people and the world and awakening empathy in the viewer. Take a good, deep look at this painting by Francisco Goya. What feelings awaken within you? And on whom do those feelings settle in this work? A row of French soldiers aim their guns at a Spanish man who stretches out his arms in submission to his fate. At his feet are a pile of dead bodies, with the earth receiving the blood of the victims. To the right in the painting, we see a line of Spanish rebels awaiting their own turn at meeting their dark fate. Some of them are praying, others watching the death that they know awaits them. Notice that these rebels are not homogeneous. They have various skin tones. They appear to come from all walks of life, with even a religious man, a friar in green pants, his hands clasped in prayer, bowing before the executioners. To the right, we can see one of the rebels wears a white head wrapping common of Spanish Muslims. Tribes often go beyond racial categories because they form over common cultural and ideological identities. Sometimes these ideological commitments supersede religious categories. When we look more closely at this work, we begin to see that it not only addresses the issue of tribalistic thinking, but it also helps us move beyond tribal thinking by calling forth an empathetic response from the viewer. It also transcends tribalism through its religious symbolism and imagery. The main figure of the painting is clearly a poor and common laborer. His gesture is in the form of the crucified Christ. This man is sacrificing himself for the sake of some higher cause. The lantern's light seems to concentrate on him, and so we sense that he is bathed in a spiritual light. The expression on his face, look at it for a moment, is not one of anger or defiance or even fear, which you would expect if this were strictly a political painting. He seems sad, as if he is expressing an anguish over the violent divisions that tribalism causes. Another way of seeing his expression is that it reflects Christ's prayer on the cross. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Now, take a close look at the victim's right hand. See that puncture wound? That is the stigmata, a reference to the marks made on Christ's body during the crucifixion. War and the threat of death are the great equalizers of men and women. We lose our sense of dividedness for the sake of a higher cause than our tiny little tribe. Yet, looking at this painting, we see really no heroes, no hint of romanticism in this work. A rebel is simply being killed by the side of the road as if he were some kind of beast. War may invite another ism, nationalism, which we will deal with next week, but war has a tendency to make various tribes within the same military community forget their differences and overcome their cultural prejudices. Well, let's turn to another artist who at first seems to deal specifically with issues of race. As we shall see, Jacob Lawrence will gently expand our perspective. He will nudge us to see the racial violence that occurred during the 1930s as Southern Blacks migrated into northern cities, invite us to see that it may have had more to do with a tribal nature than simply a racist nature. In this painting, the artist himself, an African-American, keenly aware of the suffering inflicted by racism, doesn't seem to take sides. Lawrence depicts both sides as equally violent and deadly. He seems to, in a matter-of-fact sort of way, express the heavy cost of division between fellow Americans. Here's another work in the series. Read the inscription Lawrence included with this painting. Take a moment to read it. With that inscription, Lawrence has blurred the line between racism and tribalism by emphasizing the socioeconomic aspect of the conflict. Blacks were hired as strikebreakers. The us identity of white blue-collar workers was rooted in a noble idea that hard work and loyalty to a company should result in higher wages so that these devoted workers could provide a better life for their families. The them of the Black workers reflects more the financial threat they posed. Lawrence in this migration series is very transparent about this reality. Now, Lawrence does address the stupidity of racial segregation in this panel from the series. On the right, we see at the top and the bottom, diners eating alone. On the left, white diners also eating alone. So there's an opportunity for companionship, which is denied by the ludicrous, artificial, flimsy barrier of the gold rope. I feel a sadness at the artificial nature of division expressed in this work. What do you feel? I think Lawrence has used the historical record of racial division in the United States in a way that universalizes the sadness and exasperation we feel about the disunity among all people. Painter Vincent van Gogh was quite effective in creating empathy for his subjects. Take a look at this elderly woman. What feelings does she bring forth? Would any of us care whether she is a Republican or a Democrat? How many of you would think differently about her if I told you she voted for Donald Trump? Try to seriously imagine this. Take a good look at this family, partaking of a humble meal of potatoes and coffee. What if you found out that they all believe the earth is only 5,500 years old? Would you feel differently about them? I ask this question because I think most of us listening have a progressive view of religious ideas. When I encounter someone who believes in a young earth based on their interpretation of the first couple of chapters of Genesis, internally at least, I kind of shake my head in pity. I guess I feel a little judgmental toward them. I admit it. Since I'm in the mood to confess my own tribalistic tendencies, I will also admit that I may have some preconceptions about poor rural folk, like this family appears to be. And yet, the artist has portrayed this family in such an empathetic way that any quick generalization about them on my part is quickly followed by a sense of conviction and desire to move beyond my own limited and judgmental thinking. When we really contemplate art such as this, rather than simply offer a quick observation on whether we like the style of it or not, we can discover truths about ourselves and our world. Contemplating this work, I discover a tendency toward, frankly, an elitist attitude, which is a hallmark of a tribalistic thinking among progressive liberal folk. I don't think Van Gogh could belong to any tribe. His profound empathy for other human beings is so obvious in his art. And his capacity for empathy with his subject challenges me, and maybe some of you, to move beyond our limited thinking. Now I'd like to mention specifically a tribe that has come to national attention of late and which many of us are keenly aware of. During Trump's term in office, there was a rise in membership with a community known as the Patriot Church. If you go to their website and read the beliefs page, you'll see that their members have quite traditional understandings of the Christian faith. And despite their name, you won't find anything about politics, nothing about political affiliation, no mention of country or specifically the United States. However, if you watch interviews with members of the Patriot Church, it appears political affiliation and national identity are tops on the list of their beliefs and values. In a recent NPR story about the church, the reporter recorded some of Reverend Ken Peters' sermon. Reverend Peters is a pastor of the Patriot Church in, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Lenoir City, Tennessee. Donning an anti-abortion t-shirt, the Reverend Peters proclaims with full-throated conviction, quote, "Don't let the mainstream media or the left tell you that we were not a Christian nation. You know why there's churches everywhere and not mosques? Because we're a Christian nation." Well, this statement was followed by a roar of amens from the congregation. Peter's sermon then referenced the January 6, 2021 riot of the nation's capital. He said, quote, "You know he's," and he's referring to Biden, "you know he's not the most popular president in America. How many Biden parades did you see? Yet he beat Trump with 70 million? Give me a break. We know something's up." After the sermon, the NPR reporter interviewed one of the congregation's members who on his lapel was wearing an American flag inside of a Christian cross. The member said the following, quote, "This is a spiritual battle. It's good versus evil, and unfortunately, evil has taken charge." Unquote. Well, listening to such rhetoric, you would think that anyone a little left of center or even some conservatives not sufficiently and unquestioningly supportive of Trump and the United States' actions in the world was a demon threatening to take the country and all of its citizens to hell. One of the hallmarks of tribalistic thinking is to interpret the world in stark us versus them categories, with them not simply being people who think differently, but people who are evil and threatening. Early American painter Alfred Jacob Miller captures this idea in this painting. But Miller also expressed in some of his paintings the desire for mutual understanding between Native American and European, such as this work, depicting a Native American courtship. Perhaps looking at this painting, Alfred Jacob Miller wrote, "The North American Indian carries his wonderful stoicism into every transaction of his life. Even the tender subject of selecting a helpmate does not disturb his tranquility. Neither is he affected with the slightest romance in regard to the subject. He brings his presents and casts them at the feet of his bronzed favorite, ostensibly for her, but intended for the optics of the father. These consist of cloths of brilliant colors, beaver skins, beads, trinkets, etc." As many of you know, one of my highest ideals, one which I use the arts to emphasize, is wisdom. And to remain consistent with this ideal, I know I need to uphold one of wisdom's chief teachings. Seek first to understand before being understood. Seek first to understand before being understood. A moral interpretation of this adage, which takes it to a level higher, is before you take the speck out of your brother or sister's eye, first take the plank out of your own eye. Alfred Jacob Miller's empathetic paintings of Native American life serve as reminders to seek first to understand. Well, now let's look at another kind of tribalism, a subtler form of tribalism that perhaps maybe some of us suffer from. This painting is a self-portrait by an English woman born into privilege, who grew up on a grand estate, but who became disenchanted with the confining nature of such privilege because she was a free-spirited artist at heart. Judging from her hairstyle, you could say she had a wildness to her nature that made the expectations that she find a good country gentleman to settle down with seem like a prison. Let's take a good look at this painting. Knowing she comes from privilege, how do we respond to it? Do any of us feel empathy for Leonora, or do we feel something else? Perhaps feelings not so warm toward her. Just observe your reaction before I go on. I believe, depending on your own background, you might feel empathy for Leonora's situation. You may know about the shackles of societal expectations that wealth can often bring. Or you might be saying to yourself, "Oh, please, Leonora, cry me a river." Maybe you had to work a 50 to 60 hour a week daily grind of a job just to barely make ends meet. Perhaps you had 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Well, Leonora Carrington would leave privilege behind. She would move to Mexico in her 20s and live the remainder of her life forging a career as an expatriate surrealistic painter. In order to truly understand this painting, we must read a little of the short story that inspired this self-portrait and which was written by the artist herself. So allow me to read just the beginning paragraphs because they will give you the general idea. Try to listen while also observing the work. The title of her short story is called The Debutant. The Debutant, I think, could then be a subtitle for this work. So here we go. When I was a debutante, I often went to the zoological garden. I went so often that I was better acquainted with animals than with the young girls of my age. It was to escape from the world that I found myself each day at the zoo. The beast I knew best was a young hyena. She knew me too. She was extremely intelligent. I taught her French, and in return, she taught me her language. We spent many pleasant hours in this way. For the 1st of May, my mother had arranged a ball in my honor. For entire nights I suffered. I had always detested balls, above all those given in my own honor. On the morning of May 1st, 1934, very early, I went to visit the hyena. What a mess of shit, I told her. I must go to my ball this evening. You're lucky, she said. I would go happily. I do not know how to dance, but after all, I could engage in conversation. There will be many things to eat, said I. I have seen wagons loaded entirely with food coming up to the house. And you complain, replied the hyena with disgust. As for me, I eat only once a day, and what rubbish they stick me with. I had a bold idea. I almost laughed. You have only to go in my place. Now, looking again at this painting, I want to challenge all of us to be honest with ourselves. What feelings, what thoughts arise when you look at the painting of this debutante? Now that you know a little of the backstory. Our response will tell us if we have unconsciously aligned ourselves to a particular socioeconomic tribe based on the feelings it brings forth, empathy or judgment. Carrington's surrealistic works invite us to playfully explore otherworldly realms full of both magic, but also higher knowledge. Looking at works like this, we get a sense that our normal way of experiencing reality, including all of our default judgments and categorizations of other people, is like seeing through a glass darkly. Carrington's work alludes to ancient sources of wisdom and invites us into higher realms of experience, invites us into transcendent places that often seem more real than the one we normally inhabit. The cure for tribalistic thinking is wisdom. Wisdom has a spirit of humility. It avoids mob mentality. It doesn't blindly follow convention nor the charisma of a leader. It appreciates tradition without blindly following it. Wisdom seeks to understand before being understood. In this work, Carrington invites us to consider that insight and moral wisdom, though perhaps unseen to the unimaginative eye, surrounds us. It is present in nature. It is present in a spiritual reality available to all of us if we only have eyes to see it. Leonora Carrington may have been to the manor born, but she left it behind in order to follow her calling to express artistically new worlds. Worlds that, when seen with a contemplative perspective, are an invitation to a new way of being in the world. Now, I use art in these presentations to express nobler ideals because the arts, at an unconscious level, often call us to wiser ways of living. Frankly, most of us don't want to be wise. We recognize that wisdom stands counter to many of our behaviors and ways of thinking. Wisdom challenges our tendency to mental laziness, a laziness which leads us to stupid prejudices and generalizations. But ultimately, wisdom, if followed faithfully, leads us toward greater compassion, toward ourselves and toward others. And that may be its greatest gift.